All right.
Yes. Hello, Dorothy. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking up our invitation within, such a short period of time. Thank you so much for,
You're welcome. My
and
pleasure.
we look forward to, listening to your talk, and hopefully we can all gain one or two things from what you're going to present today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us again. Our speaker for today is Dorothy McKinney. She is the director of Advanced Systems Thinking, a systems engineering consulting firm established in 2020. Prior to this, she was founder and CEO of a dot-com startup, Considered Thoughtfully, which aimed to provide just-in-time information for professionals interested in career development and professional growth. She retired in 2014 from Lockheed Martin after more than 34 years with the corporation and its heritage organizations. She spent the last years there as a fellow emeritus. She has also served as an adjunct professor in the graduate engineering program at San Jose State University, teaching subjects such as engineering management and software project management. From 2002 to 2013, Dorothy developed and taught a course on requirements engineering over the internet for Portland State University. Other industry experience include 3 years at Argo Systems, that's a Boeing subsidiary, and 9 years at SRI International, formerly called Stanford Research Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy McKinney.
Thank you. So let's see. WebEx has updated since I last used it. Are you going to share the slides or do you want me to?
Yeah, you can share the slides if you want.
Let's see. Nope. Okay. Need. If it's easy for you to share them, it looks like I would have to restart WebEx to share them. So
Oh,
Okay, yeah.
wow.
yeah,
This-
well, you have to set
yeah,
permissions.
yeah.
I set them for the old version of WebEx, but in getting ready for this, I updated WebEx and apparently the computer doesn't recognize it as the same program.
Oh,
Okay, so Ibukun, do you have a copy of the slides there?
yeah, I'm just trying to get access to that. It's
Okay, I'm going to make you the presenter as well, although I think you can do that by yourself. Um,
yeah, I'm just trying to pick the slides out now. Huh. Professor Kenley, I don't know, do you have
they're in the box drive for persist.
oh, okay, I guess.
Um, hopefully you have an easy place to.
Okay, I guess I'll just pull it out from there and that should be good to go.
Thank you so much.
Oh no, thanks so much, Dorothy. It's
We've been trying to get the logistics working. Another 3 people have joined us, so maybe that's just
yeah. Okay.
I don't see them showing up yet.
Yeah, I'm just trying to open it up right now.
Okay.
So it's a two-factor authentication
Oh,
towards getting and then yeah, it's kind of a good it's a lot of loops before we get to
Yes, universities become quite serious about security lately, Dorothy.
For good reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just see. Huh. Okay, I'm opening it up. Yeah, just a few seconds and it should pop up. So should be able to share my screen.
Hmm.
Okay, it
Not
should pop up anytime from now.
okay.
Do you have it?
Thing to share. All right.
There you go.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you very much.
And if you can, under the view, there is a full screen version, Ibukun.
Yeah, just okay.
There we go.
All right. Very good. So this is not a speech. It's a collection of thoughts and ideas. And so all of you are welcome to interject questions at any point, and I'll also stay around as long as you want at the end for questions. So I'm going to talk about some things that systems engineers have learned that are actually useful for careers for people in any discipline. And some of them are sprinkled across the first page in little stars. If you take nothing else with you out of this talk, take with you the importance of continuous learning, systems thinking, and critical thinking. And we'll talk more about each of those topics. Okay, next page. All right. So
Oh,
I've been a hiring manager for decades, and I can tell you that there's a spectrum on which new hires come. And I thought I would just mention the ends of the spectrum, which are the ones that any hiring manager dreads the most. The top end of the spectrum is someone who comes out of college using their education like a hammer. Everything they encounter, they say, okay, I'm going to use some technique or approach or analysis method or whatever that I used in school. And while all of those techniques, methods, everything you learn in school has potential use, it's not where you want to start. The other extreme is somebody that comes in and says, just tell me what to do. And so let's talk about what to do instead of that. Next page, please. So I blatantly stole this picture. The link at the bottom is the place I stole it from. And it's one of the groups that talks about systems thinking. And the picture compares and contrasts systems thinking with what they call linear thinking. And let me just mention linear thinking first is you have a tool like a hammer and everything looks like a nail. System thinking, before you even start figuring out what to do, first you understand the system and its context. In other words, what's going on? What's the bigger picture? Who cares? And why do they care? And then you go on to say, okay, now what can I do about it? That's your leverage point. And then you work with other people. So you know what they're doing, they know what you're doing. And it's a distinction between doing the right thing right and doing the wrong thing right. Next page, please. And you're welcome to read the words if you like, but Russell Ackoff made the point that we as a species do a lot of working on doing the wrong thing right. And unfortunately, that's not self-correcting. When we do the right thing wrong, then we get feedback that lets us figure out how to improve. So figuring out what the right thing to do is critically important. But it's not easy. And this comment from the same website I cited before, you have to understand the whole context within which the issue or problem exists. And it has tensions and contradictions. In fact, it's very typical that your customer, whether it's your boss or your boss's boss or your organization's outside customer, whoever cares about the product or services that you're working on, they have conflicting priorities too. And so understanding those to formulate the best way forward is not easy. And it's so tempting. We humans love to rush to solutions. And so my suggestion to you is, for career success, you want to avoid the temptation to rush to solutions, unless you can do it as an experiment. Now, if you do it as an experiment and then say, okay, I'm going to try something quickly and then see what information I have to see if I'm even tackling the right problem, then maybe rushing could help. But most of the time, it pays off much more in a career sense to look at what you need to do and what other people care about first before deciding what to do. All right, next page. So there's some challenges that we have that we didn't really have too much in the last century. First of challenges is what I call surfing the information space. It used to be, I don't know, 50, 100 years ago, that you could actually learn what you needed to learn to be effective in your job. I tell you, you can't do that. Earlier today, I was involved in a review of progress at a startup company. And one of the questions I asked was, how often do you, as the lead person working on this project, Google information to help you figure out what to do? And her answer was, every day. There's so much unknown and there's so much new development happening that if I don't look every day, my job is going to take longer and not be nearly as effective as if, anyway, so, but since you can't absorb all the information, you have to figure out how to skim the surface and only dip down occasionally when there's a need. The next challenge is understanding different kinds of stakeholders, customers with needs and constraints, people that are working on the solution with their own piece of the puzzle to address. And it used to be that most jobs involved doing something where you were working in a limited context and you could pretty much ignore everything else. That's still true for a few jobs. If you're serving food in a restaurant, perhaps you can just pay attention to the cook and the customers. But for most jobs that you use a college degree today, you have to interact and understand many more stakeholders. Next thing is dealing with complexity. And it's hard because everybody needs a mental model of the whole thing. And we humans are not organized in our brains to keep a highly complex system in our head for a very long time. So what that means is we have to look at the context and the entire thing from time to time and then focus down on the specific task we're trying to do. The next challenge is dealing with interfaces, both humans and systems. It used to be that you could work on your own piece of whatever it was and tell other people, go away, I'm just doing my work. But today, I think the last survey I read about, more than 85% of jobs require active coordination with others in order to be effective. So that's one of our challenges. And to do all these things successfully, no college education, no way of being brought up by your parents is enough to help us learn how to take risks effectively. So that's something we're going to have to practice as individuals and as organizations. And risk-taking is, it's not easy, it's not comfortable, but it's necessary for career success. It's necessary for organizations to succeed long-term. All right, next page, please. All right, here's the first of my pitches for you to take charge of your own learning. Now, if you've had great college professors, they may have done a good job of helping spoon feed you information. That is, figuring out what you need to know, organizing it in some way that you could incrementally learn it. But the real world isn't like that. And the most successful people are ones that figure out how to learn themselves. There's lots of sources of learning, including colleagues. Once you take all the information in, you've got to sort through it, understand what their possibilities are, make your judgments, understand the context, interrelationships, risks, manage scarce resources, because virtually all jobs these days, even that waitress in the cafe, involve juggling scarce resources. And so learning how to do that is critically important. And there's one takeaway I'd like you to take away from this chart. I couldn't figure out how to fit it on the chart, but you want to be selective in what you choose to learn at any given time, because most of our learning has a half-life that's measured in single-digit months. In fact, research has shown that after 3 to 6 months, most of what we've learned about a topic has drifted out of our mind unless we've put it to work. So you may remember something of it, but remembering enough of it to use systematically, which means you need to do just-in-time learning. And the only person who can figure out what you need to learn just in time is you. So that's why I think user-based learning is so critically important. Now, you can and should get mentors to help you figure out what you should learn. I mean, when you don't know what you don't know, a mentor can be very helpful in helping you understand what the universe of information out there is and what might be most useful to your job. But you also have to be motivated to learn it. So it has to be something that excites you enough for you to put the effort into learning. Next page, please. You really need to balance learning and doing. If you're going to learn something, especially something detailed and intricate, you need to make opportunities to apply it fairly soon. And to do that usually means taking risks. If you're working for somebody else, or actually if you're working for yourself as a consultant or in your own startup, you have to try things. And that means you're probably going to make mistakes. And so if you're prepared for that, and if you set your mind to say, okay, I'm going to try this, and I cannot fail, I may not succeed in doing what I initially, getting the outcome that I initially intended, but the biggest thing I'm doing here is learning. And so it turns out humans learn a lot more from mistakes than we do from success. So the next time you learn by doing and make a mistake, you can tell yourself, hey, this was really successful in that it's a much bigger bite of learning than I would have gotten if this thing had worked as I initially thought it would. Next page. So what can you do to be valuable in your organization while you're learning? Because most organizations don't say, oh, take 20% of your time and learn. There's a few that do. But most of them say, hey, what we want you to do is get your work done. Well, if you take the time and trouble to diagnose what your organization needs in the way of learning, and that's really simple. You just look around as you participate in the activities at work. One really easy target for many people is meetings. If your organization has lots of meetings and some of them some or many of them seem unproductive to you, read up a little on how to make meetings more productive. And then, for instance, you could go to the meeting organizer and say, hey, I want to get prepared for this meeting we're going to have tomorrow. Can you give me an agenda so I know what you're going to cover? Because it turns out meetings that start out with an agenda are usually much more efficient. Anyway, there's a whole list of meeting things. I won't go into all of that. You need to diagnose your own learning style. Each of us learns in different ways, and figuring out which ways work for you is really important. Sharing your knowledge. It turns out that teaching others, whether it's formally or informally, is actually one of the best ways in the world to learn yourself. Because when you sit down to try and explain something to someone, it makes it glaringly obvious in your own head of what you thoroughly understand, what you partially understand. And, it opens you up, makes you a little vulnerable, because if you tell someone, oh, well, this works best if you do it this way. And then they ask a question you weren't expecting. You may not be able to answer and you may feel inadequate. So it's a little bit vulnerable sharing knowledge with others, but it definitely improves your knowledge, and it improves your retention of your own knowledge too. You can partner with others to learn together. One simple way to do that is join or start a book club at work, where people at work read a book, maybe one chapter a month or one chapter every 2 weeks or whatever, and then just have a brief discussion. Often that's a lunch and learn type thing. Okay, next page, please. I thought I'd say a little bit about competency. Now, this particular picture shows the Department of Defense Systems Engineering Competency Model circa 2013. And I'm not going to try and go through all of the points with you, but I would like you to notice that if you think of doing the technical job, that's under the analytical box, the upper left. But in order to be an effective systems engineer, the Department of Defense and lots of other organizations, I chose this one just because I thought the breakout was easy to use from a slide and talk point of view. But they want a whole bunch of professional skills. And if you look at that list of skills, a lot of them are what you would call soft skills. So whatever your discipline major is, you need to be able to communicate and manage stakeholders and so on. And the bottom right box is how savvy you are about business. Even if you work for a nonprofit organization, the organization won't work unless it keeps a stream of money coming in. And so keeping that stream of money coming in and keeping the stakeholders that provide the money that's the gasoline on which an organization runs is really important. And if you understand how to do that, you can be more effective in your organization. Technical management, you might think to yourself, oh, hey, all this management stuff, if I'm not a manager, I don't have to worry about it. No, because if you're not a manager, then in order to be effective, you have to be well managed. And you can't understand how to do that unless you understand what a manager is trying to do and why. All right, next page, please. Another point is it's really important in art endeavors. They talk about balancing form and function. So an architect, for instance, designing a building needs to make sure that the building is going to serve the intended purpose. But they also try and make the form attractive and suitable for the purpose. So for instance, if an architect is designing a church, they want it to be able to be a gathering place for many people, have a pulpit from which a minister can talk, maybe have a choir place from where the choir can sing and so on. But they also want the building as a whole to inspire the people that come to the church to think higher thoughts and all of the things that the church is trying to do as an institution. And in any profession, you have to balance form and function. If you're really good at the form, the processes and tools, you're really good at turning the crank and getting stuff done, but you don't understand the domain in which you're working, that's a recipe for disaster. You're going to end up building the wrong thing. If you have great domain knowledge, but you don't understand the processes and tools needed to build something, and when I say build something, I mean not just a product, but also a service. In that case, what you're going to do is, it's a recipe for rework. You're going to build it wrong the first time and have to go back and fix it. So understanding in your own job, whatever job you do, what the process things, the form is, what the domain things, the function is really important. Next chart, please. So there are many process maturity models around. I've actually, this chart started out as one that showed the software process maturity model, but I took the software specific stuff off of it because there are process maturity models in many different engineering disciplines, and actually I've seen some in social science disciplines also. And basically it goes from chaos at the bottom to organization that's a little more mature, has the chaotic organizations usually have a tough time functioning. Then it goes to repeatable, meaning there's processes in place that are implemented. There's management in place. The third level is processes are in place. The fourth level is there's a focus on quality in the processes, and the fifth level is there's a focus on continuous improvement. And as you go up in maturity, the risk goes down and the productivity and quality go up. Now, you as an individual typically cannot change the maturity of the organization you're in, but you can notice it and put your efforts where they're going to be most effective, depending on how mature your organization is. So, for instance, if you have a chaotic, if you work in a chaotic organization, you can aspire to be a hero and help your organization improve to that level. But if your organization is at levels 2 through 5, then it behooves you to understand, okay, at level 2, how do we manage things? And how do I, as an individual, use those management? So, for instance, to raise risks so they'll get the appropriate amount of attention. If you're at the third level, understanding the organization's processes thoroughly is really important for you to be able to contribute effectively, and so on. All right, next chart. All right, I want to talk a little bit about critical thinking. So this chart is one of, there's many out there that talks about what you do in the way of critical thinking. And this is a real simple stair-step chart. Gather information, you have to pay attention to do that, and say, okay, what are the key points? What are the assumptions? What are arguments and evidence? And distinguishing between people's opinion and evidence is really important. In today's news world, it is very tough to understand, certainly from a headline, but all too many times, even from the body of the article, what is evidence versus just people's opinion. Then you look at these pieces and say how they relate to each other. You say, okay, how do the different sources of information compare? Similarities, differences. Then you have to do your own evaluation. So, okay, for each argument, how evidence-based is it? And how does it fit with the other pieces of evidence? Then you use critical thinking to decide if you're making a decision or figuring out a plan. And then you want to do review. So whatever action you take, you compare the outcome that you expected to what you got and improve your understanding. So it's very common, for instance, to start out on an effort with some assumptions that are unspoken by anybody and unrecognized by yourself. And if your efforts are a failure, quite often the reason is that some of those unspoken assumptions were not correct. Understanding, there's an old saying that an assumption makes an ass out of you and I. Well, you'll undoubtedly learn that the hard way multiple times in your career. But again, if you use it as a learning opportunity, it's not a loss. Next page, please. So in order to be an effective critical thinker, what do you need? Here are some of the things that help. Being open-minded, being willing to listen to points of views that are different from yours. Self-confident. In fact, I think this is a positive feedback loop. The more you try to do critical thinking, the more self-confident you're going to get. The last one, mature, it means emotional maturity. And for those of us that did education in technical fields, we don't have very many professors typically that emphasize the importance of emotional maturity, but it's very, very helpful. I can give you a whole nother talk on ways that a technical professional could get more emotionally mature, but that's a topic for a different day. Okay, next page, please. So 30 years ago, somebody made a list of the top 10 software lists. Well, I've taken off the couple of them that were software specific, but these are the top risks you'll encounter in any project. People being less than perfect. In fact, I've participated in more lessons learned exercises for projects that got into problems than I could count. And almost always what the managers that were responsible say first, they don't use exactly these words, but it means my people weren't perfect. And if you have a plan that depends on your people being perfect, good luck. It doesn't work very often. So working around human limitations. In that context, I might mention the organizations that are most effective leverage people's strengths. And I have a recipe coming up for helping you help whatever organization you work for more effectively leverage your own strengths. Anyway, sometimes we try and get things done on the cheap or too quickly. Sometimes we build the wrong thing. Sometimes we build the right thing, but we add a whole bunch of unneeded capabilities. And when we finish, the engineers are really proud of what they developed, and the people that paid for it are really sorry it has features that weren't needed. Requirements change. In the last 30 years, we've seen the pace of requirements changes on projects of all sorts, not just technical projects, but social projects change. So what you started out with, you were supposed to do, the stakeholders have either had their circumstances change or they've gotten smarter about what they need. And so what they are asking you to do will change. And then shortfalls in the supply chain and the services chain. And boy, have we seen those in spades in the last couple of years as the pandemic has taken its toll. Okay, next page, please. All right, so some steps you can take to reduce risks. Question assumptions. You don't have to do this aggressively. Just say, hey, I would like to know why we're assuming that the customer will accept what we give them without checking it out themselves, or whatever the assumption is. Everybody says, okay, pay attention to risks. And usually it's easy to pay attention to known risks. Hey, last time this company did a project like this, we had X, Y, and Z go wrong. Those are the known risks. But there's known unknowns saying, hey, we usually have a problem somewhere in supply chain as an example. And then there's the unknown unknowns. And so you need to plan discovery activities, especially if you're working with technology that hasn't been used for this purpose before, or you have a coalition of companies or other organizations that haven't worked together in this way before. You need to try things out to understand what those unknown unknowns are. You can reduce risks by understanding what the end user of your products or services expect and need. And if you ask your boss and he or she doesn't know, and then figure out other ways. Industry associations, it turns out, are good in industries ranging from engineering to medical to transportation, all sorts of different fields, are good ways to meet people that are customers of the kinds of organization you work for. It turns out that's actually true even if you work for a nonprofit. When you are concerned about a risk, talk to people about it. Don't just sit there and stew. And one of my favorites is, notice the difference between a problem and a risk. A risk is a potential future problem. One of the red flags when I review a project that tells me the project is already in deep trouble is when I ask to see the list of risks and everything on the list is already something that's gone wrong. What that tells me is they're struggling so much with the problems they currently have on their plate, they haven't even taken the time or effort to say what else could go wrong. And as serious as their current problems are, some of their other risks may be so bad that it'll cause their whole effort to fail. So you never want to put your head down and avoid thinking about risks. Okay, next page, please. Now, when you think about problems, any set of problems your project has right at the moment, is almost certainly not the full set of problems, because problems are discovered iteratively, because symptoms of some problems may mask the existence of problems that are underneath them. And so there's a phenomenon that we engineers call peel the onion, good engineering term, right? Because you have to resolve one layer of problems before you discover the next layer. Unfortunately, you can't slice the onion open to find out how many other layers there are. Next page, please. Okay, a couple comments. One of my former colleagues, Micah. You don't have to figure it all out yourself. When you see a colleague that's great, observe them, understand what their abilities are, and develop your own adaptation of those abilities. Next page. The other thing, and he was famously successful with this, and all of the people that he mentored and guided that took this to heart also were successful, is come without a personal agenda, focus on the task at hand, and ask, is this in the best interests of our organization, our customers, our employers, our employees, other stakeholders? Basically, if you make it not about you, but about, hey, how are we going to succeed in the mission of our organization? You're much more likely to be able to get people to join with you in efforts and to take any concerns you have seriously. Next page. All right, a few recipes for career success for me personally. First one is work with a whole heart. Now, in order for most of us to work with a whole heart, we have to question decisions that we disagree with, because otherwise we can end up with tasks that we believe are impossible for us to do. So if you have if you're given an impossible task, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in another recipe. Okay. If you need input and you haven't gotten it, make it up. Everybody loves to redline and tell you where you're wrong, even if they can't get around to putting together what you need for input. So make it up yourself. Just take your ego out of the way. When you make up the input that you don't have, and everybody bleeds red ink all over it, instead of thinking, oh my gosh, I'm being criticized, you think, oh great, they're finally giving me the information I need. Figure out how you think you can best contribute, and check in with yourself occasionally, maybe monthly, to make sure you're making this contribution. And one example of that, I had a colleague who was an outstandingly good designer. And since he was so good, he was asked not only to do designs, he was also asked to review other people's work. He was asked to mentor people and so on. And in one of his check-ins with himself, he figured out that he was spending 90% of his time reviewing other people's work. He wasn't doing very much design at all. And he could sort of feel his heart withering. So you need to make time to do the things that makes your heart sing. All right, next page, please. One, you can expect if you go to work that sometimes you'll be asked to do something that you think is dumb. And the main reason you're asked to do something dumb is poor communication. So if somebody asks you to do something dumb and you do it, it's called malicious obedience. You know it's dumb, but you do it anyway. What's much more effective for both your career and your organization is figure out what's actually needed and then explain it. Sometimes the person giving you the assignment doesn't know why it's dumb. And if you can clarify it for them, hey, this has been done 60 times already. This trade study has been done just last month by another part of our company. And, you know, it's a waste of money for us to do it again. Or whatever the reason is that you think something's been done, and open up the communication, and then hopefully jointly you can figure out with your leader what actually would be smarter to do with your time and energy. Next page, please. Sometimes you're given something you don't want to do. And here's what I mentioned. You want to help your organization use your strengths effectively. So the first thing to do is to communicate that it doesn't use your strengths effectively. And that communication will do at least two things. One is it'll alert them to what you think your strengths are. And understand that strengths mean both something you're good at and something that makes your heart sing. So if you're tremendously good at organizing index cards into alphabetical order, but you find it painful and boring and not something you want to do, don't list that among your strengths. The second thing that communicating your strengths can do is if the task you're being given is certainly outside of your area of strength, you can often negotiate, say, well, you know, I don't really know how to do this, but if you and I agree this is a learning opportunity, I'm willing to try and see how it goes. And usually that increases your own willingness, because most of us are scared to do something that we feel is going to fail. Often, especially in larger organizations, people get assigned to projects and move around, and so it may be the case that your current leader actually doesn't know what your strengths and interests are. They make assumptions based on what your last project was or based on what somebody told them in a hallway conversation, but if you communicate, it makes it much likelier that you'll be able to work to your strengths. But there is one caveat, and you may have to do something you don't like at all as part of paying your dues. I had one super smart individual that came to work for my organization. I actually recruited him personally. And the first assignment he was given, he came to me in disgust. I was not his project manager, I was his matrix manager, and said, you know, any newbie could do this. It's a waste of my time and energy to do it. And I did my best to encourage him to do a good job, but he didn't. He didn't get around to it. He didn't get it done in a timely fashion. And what the project leaders said, gosh, if we can't even trust him to do this small task effectively, how can we ever trust him with a big task? So he ended up leaving in disgust because he wasn't ever given the kind of task that he thought was appropriate for him. Next page, please. Recipe when somebody gives you a task and not enough time to do it. And this is unfortunately becoming more and more common. It's in your best interest to negotiate for a doable task. First thing you can do is say, oh, okay, you want it done in 6 weeks? And you're thinking to yourself, okay, 3 months is the shortest time I can do this, whatever it is they've asked me to do. Offer what you can do in that time. And sometimes you'll be surprised and pleased to find that what you can do actually will suit their needs. If they really insist on, I want you to do it in 6 weeks, even though you think it'll take 3 months, you say, okay, well, I'm willing to do it as long as we agree on some fallback plan. If I get to 5.5 weeks and it's clear that in the last half week I'm not going to get it done, we can implement that fallback plan. And the reason that I think that's a reasonable strategy is occasionally a leader does actually know better than their people what they're able to do at a given time. And I'll offer you a story from Hewlett-Packard. They had a product development cycle that took, at that point, this was several years ago, typically took 3 to 4 years for something to go from the lab to the production floor. And one day, I forget if it was Hewlett or Packard, but it was one of the founders of the company, came through, saw an employee fiddling with something at the lab bench, asked him what he was doing, and the employee explained, and Hewlett or Packard, whichever one it was, said, gosh, I'm not sure this is a good use of our resources. I don't want to see this on the lab bench next time I wander through. And he came through maybe a couple times a year. Well, this employee decided to use that as leverage. So he went and told his boss and his coworkers, hey, they want this out of the lab and into production within 6 months. And in fact, HP inkjet printers were born from that. So I don't necessarily advocate end running your boss or your boss's 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 boss by that kind of thing. But anyway, sometimes things can happen much faster than people imagine. The final thing is if you do get stuck with a project and you can't agree on a fallback plan, deliver in increments. If you have something usable in the time, then you can always go back and add to it or improve it or whatever, but at least that way you get credit for having done something. All right, next page. All right, I'll say a little bit about heuristics. I happen to be leading an effort with the International Council on Systems Engineering to put together some systems engineering heuristics. So I chose a few systems engineering heuristics to share with you. In a couple cases, I've taken out some of the engineering words, but I think these are heuristics that apply to all thoughtful employees and individuals. First one is diagnose before treating. Figure out what's going on before you come up with a solution. Second one is the project culture has to be compatible with the strategy for development. So for instance, if you work in a stodgy bureaucratic organization and somebody comes up with a plan for a project that will require everybody to take lots of risks and do things lots faster than they usually do, it's not very likely that that strategy will work in that culture. Another one that each of us can do individually and project teams probably need to do as a team is figure out what the hard parts are. Start those early. Don't, because they're a source of risks and potential problems, and may as well learn what the problems are as soon as you can. Next one has to do with human communication. The impedance mismatch, that is the ability of a listener to understand what the speaker actually meant in humans, is terrible. If you had a radio with such bad mismatch, you'd never listen to a song successfully, or rarely. So you need to understand other people have mental models that don't match your own. And so when you say something, they're not necessarily going to understand it the way you intend. Next one, don't do more analysis than the data are worth. If you have approximate data, don't do fine-grained analysis. Next page, please. Systems should be designed for change, since change is inevitable. In the early stages of a project, unknowns are a bigger issue than the known problems. The most dangerous assumptions are the unrecognized ones. Being a good team member means communicating the bad news as well as the good news. You're not, some misguided leaders say, oh, to be a team player, you need to, speak the team mantra. But if you don't bring up problems, you're not a good team player. Mistakes are understandable, inevitable, but failing to let people know when a mistake happens so that it can be dealt with appropriately is not excusable. All right, next page. Manage details through focus on high-level measurable objectives, not through bureaucracy. Don't say we have to do it that way because our process manual says we have to do it that way. Say, here's what difference I see it'll make in the outcome of our project. The next one I didn't take the engineers out of. I think engineers probably have this more than other professions, but we don't get paid to do things right. We get paid to do it just right enough, which means if somebody asks us to build a widget, it isn't the perfect widget, it's the good enough widget for the purpose of our customer. Next one is important for career progress. When you take a problem to your manager, take possible solutions with you. Even if your possible solutions don't end up getting implemented, what that does is your manager is going to see you as part of the solution rather than a whiner about problems. If anything you're doing requires change, expect resistance. People absolutely hate change, and they resist it consciously and unconsciously typically. So you have to plan to deal with it. Let other people know what you need. Otherwise, there's no point complaining when they deliver you stuff that you can't use. And keep the human dimension in mind when you're looking at decision choices. Most people overestimate benefits and underestimate risks. Next page, please. All right, let me come to conclusions and then open it up for questions. What you personally choose to focus on makes a big difference in career success. Systems thinking is valuable, whatever career you're in. In fact, I have a husband who's a CPA and also a marriage and family therapist. And he actually co-authored a paper with me a few years ago because we found a lot of commonalities with family systems theory that's used for counseling and systems thinking we use in engineering. So it really spans the spectrum. Next point is we do have challenges today that are the folks that preceded us didn't. And so we need to figure out new ways to address these new challenges. Finding strategies to continue your learning is really important for career success. I think statistics are that most people have 4 to 6 different careers between starting work and retiring. And in fact, retirement isn't, there are people that are going back to work in their 70s and 80s. So retirement is not a guarantee anymore. Most employers expect competencies well beyond whatever you took in college. You doing critical thinking saves time and effort and increases the likelihood of success of your company's efforts. And using accumulated wisdom in whatever form, heuristics being one, can help speed your efforts to learn your experiences into effective learning opportunities. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. I think there's another slide. Is there another slide that says questions? I don't remember. Maybe not. Okay. And it looks like all the participants are muted, so you might want to unmute them if you want to allow them to ask questions.
They should be able to unmute themselves. I think I gave them sufficient privilege. So Dorothy, I was curious, you've been working with some people last year or so, mostly in Silicon Valley. What has been the impact of people having to work from home in these highly interactive projects that require a lot of interaction to get something done?
So it's really interesting. I've seen actual significant increases in productivity in some organizations that were, my judgment, overly dependent on meetings. Because people, after working from home a week or two, said, I can't spend all my time in Zoom or WebEx or whatever meetings if you want me to actually get some work done. And when you were physically in the plant, there was enough cultural pressure and peer pressure and whatnot that people would show up for meetings, and they might, bring their computer with them and do a little work during the meeting. But anyway, and I think being behind a screen instead of being physically in the same room with other people gave many people a little more courage to speak up and say, hey, here's how we need to be more effective. Now, honestly, some of the improvement in productivity probably came from some of these folks working longer hours. Well, I've talked with quite a few people that traded half hour to an hour commute at both ends of their day for doing more work. Their family was used to them not being there for 9 hours a day or 10 hours a day. So that probably contributed to the increase in productivity. I have run into a number of managers that got terribly concerned. They used to manage by walking around, and we haven't developed the equivalent of walking around online yet. And so I think it was constructive for some of them because they had to focus on, okay, how can I tell if my employee is doing what's needed? And that actually was much more constructive than leaning over the shoulder and saying, what are you doing now, Bob? So anyway, For some efforts, like some of the engineering teams that I've been involved with, where we're developing hardware and software, and the hardware is multi-million-dollar hardware and has to be in a lab, and there's security issues. We've ended up making a much more uneven workload. The poor suckers who are in the lab end up getting calls from everybody asking, well, could you just try this? Could you just do that? And tell me what happens. And those folks actually ended up with more cases of COVID before we had a vaccine too. So that was pretty sad. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No, that's some good insights there. Can any students share their experience about being online and how was it for them? To Dorothy, tell her about your culture and how it was. Like Dong Yang, you were stuck in China for a year.
Oh yes, I was I was stuck in China, but most of the meetings I held with Professor Kelly, it was like pretty late at night and it's early for him. So the time difference is definitely one of the factors. I think so essentially we are working with an international team. It's really difficult to find a time that works for anyone, because you have like people from Asia and people from America and Europe, and it's hard to manage. So I have been trying to find tools to solve this problem. There are like a program that you can install on web server that you can add different places on Earth, and there's like slider to calculate when is a good time for somebody in this team. So yeah, that's one of the methods I use, but definitely time zone management is one of the important thing here in terms of collaborating online.
That can really be a challenge. One of the small companies that I've done a little work with has a team in the US and has a team in India. And when this pandemic started, they decided that the way they'd been working so far, they had like an hour or two window at each end of the day, just wasn't going to be enough. And so they set up a team in, I think it was London, somewhere in Europe anyway, and they set up a handoff process. So the Indian team hands off to the European team, and then the European team hands up. And they actually found their productivity went up significantly because each team, they got into the rhythm of handoffs, and they handed off, and then the next team would pick it up, look at what they'd done, find errors that they hadn't noticed, and then make progress and then pass it along. And so they said it was a really lucky break for their company that they had to change the way that they worked. Now, I understand that's not everybody's experience.
Dorothy, I have a question for you. Since you mostly worked in the software arena, can you think back about what the programming languages and methods you used when you started, and how many new programming languages and new methods of design did you actually have to learn to sustain your career? Just how many changes?
So probably at least a dozen. But let me tell you one counter story. Back when object-oriented first came up as an exciting thing, I was a manager of a software group, and I played around with it enough till I thought I understood it personally fairly well, and then I started teaching my whole group. And one of my graybeards took me aside after the first session I did of teaching, and he said, I understand some of these newer higher level languages it's easier to implement object-oriented. He said, but let me show you how I've been doing object-oriented development in machine language and assembly for the past 30 years. And he was actually my most, if I had a college new hire, I would assign him to work with this guy because all the college new hires that worked with him turned out great. And he said, and this is how I teach our new hires how to program. And he said, it's a way of thinking. And if you have the way of thinking, so you partition the different, object-oriented, you have objects and you have what you're doing with them. And he said, that's just part of a good way of partitioning the problem. And he said, yeah, I'll be happy to show you some of my assembly language code and show you. And so he pulled out some of we were working on a project that had some higher level and some assembly language. And he was working on the assembly language. And sure enough, it was gorgeous object-oriented design. So one of the things, another thing is over time, there are fads in languages. So for instance, one of the problems established companies have is whatever language they're using, they hire someone newly out of college, and someone newly out of college says, well, I want to use whatever their popular new language is. And they say, well, we're still using COBOL or whatever, if you're doing business programming. Fortran, if you're doing scientific programming. Now, both of those languages have evolved in the last 40 or 50 years. So today's Fortran is not the Fortran of the 1960s. Today's COBOL is not the COBOL of the 1950s. But still, what I have found is that, and the effective senior software engineers that I've worked with have pretty much all agreed, is the language is not the thing. The way of thinking and the way of breaking a problem up and coming up with solution elements, that's the important thing. And you can do that in just about any language. Some languages make some aspects of it easier. Some languages are a little more idiot-proof than others. But the basic ways of thinking are
So looks like Kyle Alvarez typed in a question.
Okay.
In the chat window.
All right, let's see if I can open the chat window. Come on.
And if it doesn't work because you're still stuck in the previous generation WebEx, we'll have to read it for you.
I can read it off real quick. Basically, my question is, do you have any advice for advocating for the usefulness of systems thinking skills to people who are skeptical of systems thinking or systems engineering in general?
So in my experience, advocating for anything doesn't work very well. You have this great idea for this approach or this process or this tool or anything that you think is a great idea. Advocating for it doesn't work very well. What does work, however, is using it yourself, getting better results than other people, and then helping them understand how the better results were obtained. And by the time that because they want better results too, and by the time they start obtaining the better results, you can then congratulate them for learning systems thinking or whatever it is you're pushing. But if you try to push, people hate change, and, it can be the best idea since sliced bread, but if it wasn't their idea, it's really hard to convince them. It's much easier to drag them along with you in the tail of your success. Now, occasionally you'll find somebody that's like-minded, and so you can have more than one of you, a small group of people, jointly do something, and then have the joint success be the thing that you use to drag other people into it. But advocating per se, boy, that is the hard way, and it very, very rarely ever works. The only time advocating can work, in my experience, is when a major problem happens in your organization and you have done the homework ahead of time to figure out how your idea, whatever it is, can help with the major problem. And then you bring this, because the times an organization is open to new ideas is when they're desperate. But you can't just recommend it as an idea when they're desperate. You also have to have a plan for doing something to implement it. And I've had colleagues who put together, they thought of something that they thought would be much more effective and have had an opportunity come up within a month or 2 or 3 of their putting together this plan. And I've had colleagues, and sometimes myself, where it takes 2 or 3 years before an opportunity comes up. But boy, when there's a big enough failure and I have my plan ready, I can get the company to listen. So does that help at all? I guess I can tell you one story in that regard.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry, my mic was muted. Yeah,
Ah.
it did answer. It helped answer me a lot. I think because I'm a new systems engineer, I don't have anything to show yet. So I was also like a similar mindset. Well, once the day comes around, I have a product to show off. Then I kind of have like street cred. I can say, well, here is the benefits of systems thinking, as I did blah blah blah, and then
Uh-huh.
as opposed to me just sprouting when I was learning classes and just like in abstract terms. But if it has something that's more physical, you know, digitally or actually something that's built, then that could probably be a lot easier. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
You don't necessarily have to wait for the end of a big thing. You know, any project has incremental steps, and sometimes you can find a step where your approach will make a big enough difference that you can use that success to persuade them. And, you know, maybe do it in a matter of months rather than years, depending on how long your efforts take to come to a final product.
You were going to tell a story about.
So some years ago, I was manager of software in a piece of an organization. Each piece of the organization, their software managers got together. We got together quarterly and talked. And we were all trying to push software process improvement, and it was not popular in those days. And so a couple of the parts of the organization that had been successful in implementing software process improvement related that the reason they were successful is they had a major failure on a program, and they used software process improvement to fix the problem, and that success caused their organization to think, yeah, this is a good thing in general. And so what the rest of us decided to do, we hadn't had any major failures, is we would seize on the next minor failure that came up, and we would make a big deal of it and, you know, shout and wave our arms and say, oh, you know, the sky is falling, and use that smaller failure as leverage. And in fact, each of us did that in our own part of the organization in our own ways. And the entire corporation ended up implementing software process improvement. And it made a big difference to the bottom line, because before that implementation, we had routinely lost several $1 million a year to project problems across the corporation. And it isn't that we didn't have any problems after that, but the magnitude was dramatically less. A couple orders of magnitude. We were talking about, you know, instead of millions of dollars, we were talking about tens and tens of thousands of dollars, which is still painful, but it's nothing like millions of dollars of losses.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Other questions, comments?
May I chime in?
By all means.
First, I would like to say thank you for this presentation. I'm someone who has spent 2 years in the business world and 9 years working as a professional in higher education. Many of the things that you're talking about, I learned the hard way. So if anyone is early in their career or has not yet entered their career, seriously, just watch this recording like 10 times, because there's so I can't tell you how much valuable information is here, and also things that I was taking notes on as well that were new things for me to chew on. So there was an incredible amount. I don't know, as somebody who speaks in front of people occasionally, sometimes we don't get this feedback, and I just want to tell you, this is awesome. This information is so good. And I would also just encourage Kyle, you don't have to wait for a product. You can do it with a process. I was recently put in charge of a working group, also known as a committee. And I said, we're going to use this process. We're going to try this other thing that I'm familiar with, since I'm the one who's been given ownership of this. And that gave me the opportunity to say, hey, look at this new type of thinking that we're trying in the organization. And people have been ranting and raving about it. So getting them on board when you have ownership of even something small can be tremendously helpful. You don't have to build and develop an entire product. You can do it with a small system. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dorothy. This has been such good information in such a small amount of time. So much wisdom here.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So actually what you said reminded me of another story, if you guys have a few more minutes. I was going around our entire division of our corporation to all the different business units, saying, here's how we need to do some improvement in our systems engineering activity. And I went to talk to people on one project, highly classified project. We've been working with that customer for decades. And they said, you know, we are so successful with what we're doing now, and our customer is so happy with us. We think it would be a stupid risk to try any of the new changes that you're talking about. So I thought about it a minute and I said, well, let me tell you something. So at that time I was working for Lockheed Martin. And I said, you know, Lockheed Martin today, and it may have changed since then, but at that day was the biggest and most successful defense contracting company in the United States. And I said, what's happening is our customers' expectations are rising. Since we are out there as number one, what they are now expecting is not just good that we've done in the past. They're expecting us to be exceptional. And you may not see it now, but you guys have a sole source contract that you've had for several decades. And if you don't up your game, you ain't going to keep the business in the long term. And they went away and talked about it and came back and said, God, that was the kick in the pants that we needed. We really, you know, we hadn't realized that we'd gotten complacent. Anyway, so sometimes people are open to the message. If you can provide some reason for their benefit, for them to think about it. Other comments, questions?
Dorothy, I have another question if nobody else has anything. So as I mentioned, I've spent a couple years in business and many years in higher education. And I am somebody who is approaching systems thinking from a non-technical background.
Uh-huh.
And so it's quite the challenge for me, to say the least, because my brain operates in a different way, but I find it incredibly rewarding, and I do appreciate the things that I'm learning. That said, for someone who is in my shoes, who's interested in looking at systems thinking from a business standpoint, but doesn't have the technical background that engineers have, what would your recommendations be?
So interestingly, systems engineering is a profession that's shaped like a T. We're an inch deep across most of it. And then most systems engineers have a sort of a stem of the T, some discipline that they know more about. But some years ago, when IBM was a little larger company than it is now, IBM decided to hire systems engineers from different backgrounds. So some of the schools that teach great books, you know, you have 4 years of undergraduate study of great books. They hired a number of them and said that what we want is your thinking skills. Now, they were not explicitly taught systems engineering, but the great books curriculum ends up exposing you to a huge amount of system-related things. So they had to learn how to put it in the context of the technical work. But they actually turned out to be some of the best darn systems engineers IBM ever recruited. Now, there's lots of debate in the industry about whether you could ever be an effective systems engineer without being a super engineer in just one discipline. But I've actually had the privilege to work with some of those folks that started out actually before I did, and matured into, I'm sure they didn't all mature into that great ones, but obviously the ones that were left by the time I worked with them were. And so I guess the best advice I can give you is play to your strengths. In addition to the knowledge you have, there's probably some kinds of insights, some kinds of analyses, some kinds of thinking that you're better at than other people. And if you figure out how to apply those, it doesn't matter if you don't have the depth in other things. Now, knowing what you don't know is important too. And then building yourself a network of people that you can call on for help with the things that you don't know. That can be very effective too. So. I guess the other possible suggestion is look for a few mentors. I never think of mentors in the singular because there's never going to be any one person that has all of the insights and perspectives that would be useful to you. But anyway, that can help you figure out how to leverage your strengths more effectively. So,
Excellent. Thank you so much.
sure. Other questions, comments? I see we're coming near to the end of your scheduled time. So I will leave it to the organizers to decide whether we're done or want to continue.
I think they're done. Let's see. Oh, there's Ibukun. I didn't see him on. Ibukun, do you want to close us out here? Oh,
He's muted.
there we go.
He's still muted. Oh, there he goes.
Okay, I'm good now. Yeah. I was asking questions about, any further comments, any further questions, but it seems we don't have any questions for now. So thank you so much, Dorothy, for this awesome presentation. I mean, I'm glad someone like Sean, someone like Kyle, I mean, a lot of us really benefited from this. I guess some of us will be getting back to listening to the recordings again. Thank you so much for this. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation and joining us within this short period. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Stay tuned for our next Colloquium meeting. That's going to be in a fortnight. We'll send you information regarding that. And I guess I'm wishing you all the best for the week as the week winds down. And I guess we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye,
again,
Dorothy.
Dorothy.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
Bye.
all right.
Bye,
Thanks a
everyone.
lot.
Yeah. Bye.